I'm Matt Ryan, this is Historically Speaking, and this is our third chapter on the first ever national promotion and all the wild nonsense that allowed it to happen. If you're new here and found this show on TikTok or YouTube, thank you so much for supporting secret wrestling history being told right here on this show and, well, wherever else you're watching this. Let's get you caught up on where we are. The TLDR version is that Eddie Einhorn and Pedro Martinez were two men known for being willing to take big risks to make things happen in their respective industries. While Einhorn was building his syndication and broadcast empire within the world of sports, both pro and college, Martinez was building a wrestling fiefdom in the Rust Belt, as he would take over the western New York area from Olympian Ed Don George after Martinez's attempts in New York City would run away faster than a spooked horse, as Toots Mondt would soon find himself back in power and on his back inside the second Madison Square Garden. So here we are in Buffalo in the 1950s and 60s, which were pretty dope if you were a wrestling and sports fan. The rise of the Buffalo Bills, baseball in the area, and the growth of Pedro Martinez and his wide world of wrestling. That's right, before the ICW and the IWA naming agita we talked about in Chapter 1, Martinez would have a TV show, and that would develop into something called the National Wrestling Federation, but we're not there yet. With his booking office firmly ensconced in Buffalo, Martinez was not one to sit idly by while things were good. He was always looking for something bigger, ways to bring in more revenue, more towns, more opportunities, and of course it led him back to New York City and Madison Square Garden, because the politics of New York City wrestling are like a toxic relationship in which no one can ever really escape. And I say that with full experience.
For wrestling here in Buffalo, ready to enjoy themselves on the ropes. That means you've got to break and break cleanly. And Atkins, he steps right out. They're supposed to break cleanly. Step back with hands high. Nice takedown by Fred Atkins.
But before we go back to the regional mafia, we go back to the national mafia. By the time Martinez is back as the promoter of record in Western New York, and his NWA membership proving as such, the feds show up. That's right, the federal government was putting together an investigation into the National Wrestling Alliance and a potential monopoly on the pro wrestling business. It's not entirely Toots Mondt's fault that the biggest governing body in wrestling fell into the federal crosshairs, but Johnny Doyle was a well-respected booker and personality in the NWA's vaunted Hollywood booking office in Los Angeles.
From Hollywood, California, the glamorous entertainment capital of the world, we invite you to 1 hour of fast championship action, viewing one of the nation's top sports events. Your thrill-packed program of championship wrestling, featuring Mr. Wrestling himself, Jules Strongbow, ex-heavyweight wrestling champion of the world, who's waiting with your ringside tickets to see tonight's event at the world-famous Hollywood Legion Stadium, scene of the greatest sports events held in Hollywood, California. And it's here at the famous Hollywood Legion Stadium, just off Hollywood Boulevard in Hollywood, California, that many of your top sports events originate on the television networks of America. And here is Mr. Wrestling himself, Jules Strongbow, with your ringside tickets to see tonight's top event of championship wrestling. So let's go take our seats beside Hollywood's most famous starlets and movie stars, as well as the nation's top sports figures who come here each week to see thrilling championship wrestling from the Hollywood Legion Stadium here in Hollywood, California.
Doyle could lay claim to the first ever television championship in wrestling with his NWA Beat the Champ television title, which was established in 1951 and ran well into the 1980s, featuring top names such as Nick Bockwinkel, Greg Valentine, and Mondo Guerrero, amongst dozens of others, holding it during various points of its existence. In 1954, following Martinez's withdrawal from the New York City area, he looked to join the Manhattan booking agency after selling his shares in the Los Angeles office following a nasty divorce from his wife of 22 years and settling a case out of court with Catherine Monroe, an actress who claimed Doyle hit her after she spurned his advances. Yeesh. And That would lead to Doyle selling his shares to the stepfather of Judo Gene and future LA promoter Mike LaBelle, Cal Eaton. Doyle would make his way to New York City. But then Mondt filed for bankruptcy, and Doyle, who sold his shares in the Hollywood office, was now left hanging in the wind, and whims of broken souls and racetrack receipts cascaded around him while he lived on the beaches of Malibu plotting his next move. So he did what many would have done, looking for a new start. With a dream in his soul, he moved back to Hollywood to chase his dreams and start opposition like every wrestling promoter does. This is just what they do. As we will learn in this series, no matter who you are, where you are, or what you think you've got, NWA will always come for everything you have times 50. While it would not have been as raucous as some of the wars we'd seen later in the 1970s or 80s, Doyle, a man who once was a champion and a founding member of the Alliance in terms of a championship committee, he found himself on the short end of the NWA shit list. Yet Doyle's name wasn't mud in the eyes of TV station managers, as his comeback in Tinseltown would be bolstered by television in Las Vegas on KLRJ-TV and Los Angeles on KTTV, on top of a deal working with the man operating the Dumont Network's Chicago wrestling show, Fred Kohler. Now, Kohler was a member of the NWA, and, well, so was Doyle's competition, Hugh Nichols and Cal Eaton, who, per research from Tim Hornbaker, worked out a deal with the Chicago wrestling magnate to stop supplying Doyle talent during the NWA's annual convention in September of 1955. Not only does this kill the pipeline for Doyle's events, but all but kill his television deals in Vegas and LA because they hinged on featuring quote-unquote television superstars from Kohler's program. After being ran out of town on a rail by men he used to make money for, Doyle had a few options. First option was to pack it up and call it quits. The second was to try to make peace with his former bosses and return to the office if the bridge is not completely burnt, or go to the feds, who were already looking into the NWA. In a letter dated September 6, 1955, Johnny Doyle wrote to the Department of Justice's Stanley Disney and said that unless some action is taken to prevent the National Wrestling Alliance from blacklisting wrestlers and threatening to blacklist wrestlers who appear at Las Vegas, I cannot carry on. This goes back to Vegas being considered one of the areas controlled by the LA booking office, which was challenged by Doyle upon his return to the left coast, booking that 52-week TV contract and signing a card on August 11th that would feature Antonino Rocca in the main event. 7 days before the show, though, our old friend Toots Mondt, still Rocca's manager, returns to our story to say the deal was done without his knowledge and in violation of his contract with Rocca. In that same letter to Disney, Doyle claimed Mondt had explained that the NWA membership had put enough pressure on him to bend as Mondt's back was still against the wall, as it was a year prior when he was holding his jaw while looking up at the ceiling of Madison Square Garden, and Pedro Martinez was making sure to see if his fingers were broken. In that letter to Disney, it would be revealed that the source of all this information was coming from Kohler's booker, Jim Barnett. Okay, so this is one of those people that we're going to be talking about a lot. Barnett was briefly mentioned in the article from our friend at the New York Daily Mirror, Dan Parker, and is in the Toots Mondt category of a person you owe in the entire framework of modern pro wrestling due to his innovations and ability to develop talent and territories while holding space that they were probably not the best people, like as people. The issues between Kohler and the NWA ran fairly deep, as in March of '55, Kohler's long-running wrestling show from the International Amphitheater was canceled by the Dumont Network, which had been airing the program. The ban was more than likely celebrated by the Alliance, who had called for a ban of nationally televised wrestling programs, such as the ones produced out of Chicago, Houston, and Los Angeles during their 1954 meeting, and Kohler would lay all of the blame of that cancellation at the feet of President Sam Mushnick and the NWA. President Sam Mushnick and the NWA. The fear, the sheer terror of the idea of any promoter becoming bigger than the Alliance. The idea was enough to do untold harm to the entirety of the industry. As I've said numerous times, there are trends in pro wrestling, and the biggest one is promoters screwing themselves over a lot just to screw someone else just a little bit more. Just a little bit more, just a skosh. And following that, in June, the Justice Department would officially announce their investigation into pro wrestling and the NWA. Stanley Disney would then ask that a civil case be brought in Los Angeles, against the NWA. Whoo, baby, this was not looking good. Mushnick would later admit in a letter that the NWA had abandoned the true purpose of the alliance and expressed a willingness to cooperate with the government while negotiating for a hearing which would be set for January 3rd of 1956. Mushnick blamed Doyle for the circumstances the NWA was in, as Doyle would appear before the California State Assembly Subcommittee on Boxing and Wrestling. He would go on to bury Eaton, who he had battles with as a promoter, and claim that not only was Eaton squeezing him out of Los Angeles, but was forcing promoters to only work with his office. Much like Martinez and his loathing for Mondt, Doyle would spend a fair amount of time the next few years looking to tear down the empire Eaton was building inside the Los Angeles Olympic Auditorium. In December of '55, the NWA would witness Thesz say, "I gotta catch my bus," and sell his entire stock of Mushnick's office and drop the NWA world title to Whipper Billy Watson soon after to avoid being wrapped up in the impending shitstorm coming to the NWA's door. Or was there? The hearing Mushnick had hoped for had come to fruition, and on January 3rd, 1956, Mushnick, promoter Eddie Quinn, who also served as the Alliance's vice president, and NWA lawyer Harry Soffer met with Assistant Attorney General Stanley Nelson Barnes and FBI agent George Durr. Once in the room with these officials, the NWA guys broke kayfabe quicker than you could say the word, as they would cop to most of the charges. Now, if you had no understanding or prior knowledge of how American government worked in the 20th century, or honestly at any point throughout the country's history, you'd think, wait, they admitted it. It should all be over. And yet, NWA got away with all of it. All they had to do was do a complete reevaluation of alliance rules and basically start over from scratch. That's it. Just the biggest sticking point was that a consent decree would be adopted, and that would be the biggest punishment for the NWA, as several politicians, including Congressman Mel Price and Senators Everett Dixon and Estes Kefauver, were friends of Sam Mushnick, Fred Kohler, and Tennessee promoters Nick Goulas and Roy Welch, who might have influenced the Justice Department just a little bit. June 8th would be an important day, as all sides would meet to agree on the consent decree, but the Antitrust Division would make sure that the alliance knew every member needed to sign this binding agreement. After being approved by the government on June 25th, it would be signed by Attorney General Herbert Brownell Jr. The process would drag out until September 1st of that year, when all 36 members of the alliance would meet at the 9th annual NWA convention, where they would sign the consent decree. Upon signing it, the NWA would dissolve its initial form, and the members agreeing to cancel all rules, regulations, and bylaws, setting up new ones within the terms of the court order. By January 4th, Thesz had won back his championship 2 months prior on November 9th, and a copy of a new NWA rulebook was mailed to the Justice Department. On December 19th, Stanley Disney would issue a statement that the case on the NWA was closed, as the NWA would go back to the same shenanigans as before, but now with a strongly worded letter from the government. Cal Eaton would leave the alliance soon after signing the decree, and after pressure from a new athletic commission, would sell the office to wrestlers Jules Strongbow and Sandor Szabo. We'd skip ahead a few years in this story to 1959. Barnett and Doyle had remained friends, as Doyle would be less than welcome in California, moving himself to Virginia to work for a new group known as the Capital Wrestling Corporation, under the auspices of Vincent J. McMahon and Toots Mother Bleepin' Mondt. That's right, the Capital Wrestling Corporation. Johnny Doyle is one of the founding fathers of the company that would eventually become World Wrestling Entertainment. Doyle publicly would be the primary matchmaker, vice president, and treasurer of Capital, and McMahon was the president, as both would get to business booking shows in and around Washington, D.C. Doyle would stay with the McMahon outfit until 1957, where he'd go to work with Tom Bowser, setting up their studio TV on Boston's WBZ. The move would see Doyle bring the promotion to new heights behind the work of Killer Kowalski, who'd bring the New England wrestling scene to the forefront. Soon after getting Boston off the ground, Doyle would look towards New York, eyeing a show possibly from the Sunnyside Gardens in Queens, but was truly focused on his Boston studio show, airing on Friday nights on Channel 9 WWOR. And that would debut on November 7th, 1958, while the Sunnyside Gardens would get their own show in September of '58 on what is now Channel 5 in New York City, from former MSG promoter Rudy Dusek and pioneer of the NBA Haskell Cohen. Dusek and Cohen were the producers of the studio show for the Dumont Network's first ever program from their telecenter, which launched in 1955 on WABD.
WABD, Channel 5, the station to watch,
which would air from 9 to 11 p.m. In June of '56, McMahon would poach the time slot from Dusek and Cohen with his Washington-based program, which would now air on WABD. Turnabout would be fair play, as both shows would end up airing on that same channel in '58 and drive the elder McMahon up the wall. That channel is now WNEW, Channel 5 in New York, and yet again, we are just repeating the same fucking cycles. It's maddening. It's maddening. It's just the same thing again. But let's move on to another piece of insanity. While Barnett had grown into one of the biggest shoot managers of talent in the entire industry, leading to him buying out Indianapolis in 1958, developing studio TV himself on WTT-TV, and opening an office in the Claypool Hotel in Indianapolis. He'd also take Cincinnati, negotiating with the Cincinnati Gardens, which was nearby, allowing him to come into the territory with television airing on WCPO-TV starting in January of '59, with the 23rd of that month featuring Barnett's star attraction, Dick the Bruiser, former NFL player, alongside Edward Carpentier, Wilbur Snyder, and Angelo Poffo in the headline, and Yukon Eric and Bobby Manigault on the undercard, for 8,667 fans walking through the turnstiles of the Cincinnati Gardens. The move into Cincy would see Barnett in a war with Ohio promoter Al Haft, who might have been a bit miffed when a report from the Athletic Commission came out on the 28th of January, claiming that the take from Barnett's first event was more than its entire wrestling income for the state in 1958. According to research from the Wrestling Classics message board, the gate for that night was $16,700, which in 2025 dollars is about $181,680.45. And at the time, the state was pulling in 5% of the gate, which came out to $840 on that night, or in today's money, $9,138.42. Meanwhile, in 1958, the state would pull in for the year just $655, which would in 2025 be $71.50 and change. Haft, not running at the Gardens, that seated over 11,000 people and had air conditioning, but instead ran the more intimate 2,200-seater Emory Auditorium. And the fight was on. A battle was coming. Barnett would soon seek help for this burgeoning empire and call upon his old friend, Johnny Doyle. Isn't it wild how the NWA, instead of saving national television or building off of nationally televised wrestling, just shot it dead in the street? It's like pro wrestling is governed by the idea of the most desperate act of self-preservation isn't the thing most likely to kill you and put you in the discard pile with everyone else. And that no one, the last 70 years, dared look that in the face and try once not to do that. Just once. Would love it. Just once. Also, the WWE was created accidentally because the NWA were too chicken shit to let Doyle back into the NWA, and they could have cut that off at the pass years earlier by just being cool. How do you even, what the and, the WWE now can be looked at in the frame of history as an AEW insurgent outsider promotion because of the marketplace and there being a monopoly by the end of... We're gonna put a pause on this right here, but do not fret. We're gonna pick this back up in just a couple of days with the second half of this chapter. From how Doyle and Barnett split up the territory, the other NFL star that was called on to help build up the operation, and the possibility of a whole bunch of messiness involving Rock Hudson of all people. So we're going to be back next week, no later than Tuesday, with the final half of this chapter. I need to stop it here because I gotta edit all this and get it to you. Historically Speaking is a production of the Intergalactic Sports Network and is produced by Ember Media. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're ingesting this content, and I'll see you sweet babies in a couple of days.